And first, we're going to start with Dr. Angela Chun. So, Dr. Chun completed her fellowship in pediatric rheumatology this summer, and he's recently joined the Lurie Children's Hospital of Chicago as an assistant professor of pediatrics in the Division of Rheumatology at Northwestern University. She has almost a decade's worth of experience in global health, and I think she's going to be telling us a lot more about her background as she starts her presentation. But we're also delighted that she is now the Associate Program Director of the Pediatric Rheumatology Fellowship at Northwestern University. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Chun for the first presentation.
Thank you, Maria, for the introduction. A little about myself. So, as Maria mentioned, I just joined on as faculty at Northwestern University. But before I kind of fell into the world of pediatric rheumatology, I spent about a decade of my life kind of committed to the global health realm. But early on, as a medical student, I was exposed to pediatric rheumatology pretty early on. And so it was always on my radar. But as I was trying to decide what career I wanted to follow, I felt conflicted about where I wanted to kind of end up. And so what I realized is, that I wanted to kind of take what I learned with my experience globally and kind of act locally, especially for pediatric rheumatology, which is a small field that's not well understood. So consequently, kind of underrepresented, underfunded. And so I decided to go into pediatric rheumatology at Baylor College of Medicine, which is where I was first exposed. During my fellowship, I also obtained my master's of education because what I really learned from my experiences abroad is that education is truly the most sustainable form for patient advocacy. And I really wanted to incorporate that into my career moving forward. So, what I noticed during my fellowship is when I was doing consults and taking calls and meeting families in the clinic, I started to notice that children with skin of color were not being diagnosed with rheumatic diseases in a timely fashion. And that's definitely a multifactorial issue, but partly it seemed that it was because pediatric providers were not recognizing the pathognomonic rashes in different complexions. So sometimes I would get calls from residents and they would say the patient has a rash on their knuckles and it looks like where it would be for Gottron's papules, but it doesn't look very erythematous and it doesn't look like the photos that I learned about in medical school. So I'm not sure. And so that really showed me that there was a disconnect between what people were learning during training and what they were seeing kind of day to day in the clinics and the ER. And then, of course, we are also currently over relying on patient referrals to a very limited pool of pediatric rheumatologists. What I thought that we needed is we need dedicated educational materials specifically showing how rheumatic rashes look like in the different complexions. And then also, kind of just as importantly, we need to partner up with and educate general practitioners to initiate appropriate laboratory and imaging evaluations after recognizing these visual diagnoses, because they're often the ones on the front lines who are seeing these patients first before deciding whether or not they need to refer to a rheumatologist. So I tried to look into kind of the literature at where we're at. And so this was a paper published in Rheumatology in 2021 by Babul et al. And they looked at all of the images of dermatomyositis. So the caveat is this is both juvenile and adults, but they're looking at all the images published in medical textbooks, on the databases, and then they graded it objectively on a scale used by dermatologists to kind of rate how fair to dark complexion the patient photos were represented on. And they found that 73% were representing very fair or light skin complexions. And then this also went hand in hand with another paper published in 2021 by Rana et al. And they looked at the kind of same thing, but looking at lupus. And again, they found that 56% of the images represented were in patients with very fair complexion. And so to me, this showed that there is definitely a great need, especially since there aren't many resources dedicated to the pediatric side as well. And so I started off with kind of a needs assessment. And so I had our chief residents kind of email out to the pediatric residents interest survey to see where we're at. And these are the responses that I got. So I got responses from all 3 years of residence that they were interested in getting more dedicated pediatric rheumatology teaching. But what I found interesting is that about a third of them said that they actually have already had some form of formal teaching in pediatric rheumatology previously. But when you look at the ratings of 1 to 5 on a Likert scale, how comfortable do you actually feel making rheum diagnoses at that time? The vast majority said 2 out of 5. And so to me, that kind of pointed out not only is there a need for dedicated pediatric rheumatology curriculum, but also the need for repetition to kind of help cement these kind of teaching points long term. And so to address this, I wanted to dedicate my kind of scholarly project through my master's of education to look at this issue and kind of develop a curriculum addressing it. And so I gave a virtual workshop that focused on, again, visual diagnoses and how they present on a spectrum of patient complexions. And I focused on, at that time, lupus, juvenile dermatomyositis, and systemic sclerosis. And I ended up giving it virtually after hours because it was still during the pandemic. I wanted to make sure that the learners were really engaged and participating throughout the modules and using interactive tools such as Kahoot, which is a free medical education resource where you can kind of use gamification to make it more interactive and fun for the learners. And so this is kind of just a sample question of the game that we played, again, with the goals to, through making it more interactive and fun, that these learners will kind of seal it more into long-term memory. And so I was a little bit pleasantly surprised by the positive feedback that we got from the residents. And so on the left side, you can see some of the comments. I think a big point that I took away from it is that they really did truly love the interactive gamification aspect of it. And then on the right side, we tried to objectively show kind of improvements in the various learning objectives that we had aimed for. And so in all of the different learning objectives, there was a good enough pre and post difference, but because of the small sample size, we couldn't really look at the statistical significance. But what I took away from this kind of initial kind of needs assessment and workshop is that, one, residents were interested and excited about getting peds room education. They really enjoyed the gamification knowledge, the need for not only dedicated education, but also repetition, and then the need to build on baseline knowledge and entry behaviors. And so what I realized is that my goal is not to, as a pediatric rheumatologist, teach other pediatric rheumatologists. I want to teach the general practitioners. And so I need to kind of be aware of what skills they already have in terms of history and physical exam, and kind of build on that so that they become more comfortable with looking for the nuances within rheumatology. And I also want to focus on clinical applicability and generalizability, and also being very aware that my target audience is for pediatric and family medicine residents who are very busy. And so making sure that they're able to do this at their own time, being aware that they are already over demanded in terms of their time. And so based on this kind of coincided perfectly with the call for proposals from the Arthritis Foundation, looking for proposals supporting diversity, equity, inclusion, and cultivating a new generation of rheumatologists. My program director and my co-PI, Dr. Andrea Ramirez, we decided to apply. As the first part of this grant, we are taking the elements of my curriculum from the interactive workshop and expanding it into 4 online interactive self-paced modules. So we're adding another module specifically on arthritis, so looking at the spectrum of JIA, including how rashes look in terms of psoriatic arthritis and systemic arthritis, and then making sure that, again, they're supposed to be self-paced, 30-minute online modules that learners can do on their own time, but also the focus is on how do you make these diagnoses in patients in a spectrum of complexions? And then once you make that diagnosis, what's the initial evaluation that you should be able to do before you're able to get that child in to see a pediatric rheumatologist? This is a flyer that we created to kind of help advertise the modules once they're completed. And if you are interested in being kind of directly emailed when this is available, I did include both our email address, which is pedsroomdiversity@gmail.com, but also a Google form that you can scan right now and fill out so that I can make sure to kind of help distribute this to interested learners. And so the second part of it is kind of addressing how can we cultivate a more diverse workforce for the future. And so we were granted funds to host learners. So DEI, with a DEI initiative, so looking for learners, so either medical students or pediatric residents or med peds residents who are considered an underrepresented in medicine defined by the NIH. We invited them to come rotate with us either for a 1-month clinical rotation or a 3-month research rotation, specifically focusing on pediatric rheumatology with the hopes to kind of brought in interests in our field. And so we initially posted on the American Academy of Medical Colleges DEI bulletin board virtually, and we got a lot of interested responses. We have 5 rotators confirmed for this coming year, and I put stars kind of over the map of where they are. And so we have learners from El Paso, from Louisiana, from New Jersey, from Rhode Island, kind of all over. All of them will be coming in for a clinical rotation with Texas children. I want to introduce our first rotator, Norman, who actually just completed the rotation today. And so I want to share something that I read in his initial application that really stood out to me. So when I asked, why are you interested in learning more about pediatric rheumatology? His response is, there's a common Southern saying that goes, be careful not to miss the forest for the trees, which eloquently expresses my approach to medicine. Complex multisystemic pathology is where the real fun in medicine lies, which I truly love, because if you're a rheumatologist, if you know, you know. And so he just completed the rotation. He was a great fit. And so when I was kind of gathering his thoughts at the end of the rotation, I did also ask him these 2 questions, which are, what are 3 changes that you'll incorporate into your clinical practice after this rotation? And he really kind of knocked it out of the park. He kind of talked about how he felt more comfortable taking a comprehensive rheumatologic history. He was able to demonstrate a full PGALS exam and then be able to form differentials based on his findings. He said that he felt more comfortable thoughtfully interpreting inflammatory markers and then counseling patients and families on new rheumatic diagnoses. And he did say that, even though he's currently still in medical schools, he's an MS4, he said, I feel much more confident in identifying and managing these conditions moving forward. And then because our rotation was kind of 2 parts, so both focusing on the clinical aspects of pediatric rheumatology, but we also try to emphasize the DEI kind of issues also within pediatric rheumatology. The second question I asked him was, what medical issues surrounding DEI has this rotation opened your eyes to, and how you incorporate it into your future practice? And so his response I really loved. He said, grappling with the psychological implications of one's own body attacking itself presents its own unique challenges, but when that's compounded by additional social and financial hurdles, can place even further strain on the patient and their family support system. And he said that he had a better awareness of the costs and utility of the tests that he's sending. So he wants to be more targeted in his diagnostic workups. But he said it also overall opened his eyes to the burden of autoimmune diseases on minority patients and communities. Again, he's our first rotator, but I'm really excited with how it turns out. And we're all very excited to kind of continue to offer these rotations for the other applicants who are coming later this fall and in the spring. And so when I try to reflect on my journey so far, I think these are the points that I want to leave with. So I think first and foremost, what I've learned is that representation matters. So whether it's the photos in your medical textbook, or the doctor that a child sees in the clinic, or the faces that we look up to in a leadership position, having that diversity and that representation matters. And those effects kind of trickle down all the way. And then in terms of trying to take what I've learned from my past in global health, especially for pediatric rheumatology, which is a very small field, in terms of being able to kind of build up a diverse workforce for the future, I think, and a very important lesson is we need to partner up with our locals. So in this case, that's going to be our general practitioners, our pediatricians, our emergency room doctors, our family medicine physicians, to really partner and collaborate because we know that we at this time are very, very small and we need to help build up that workforce, but it's going to take time. And then also being aware of kind of a grassroots approach in terms of how to recruit more people into our field and being able to build those pipelines and those opportunities very early on for interested learners to help them, find their path within pediatric rheumatology sooner so that they can continue kind of pursuing it and making those connections as they make each step forward. And then lastly, when we make a curriculum, making sure that all of our stakeholders' voices are heard, right? So if we're creating curriculum specifically for residents, asking them, what are you looking for in a curriculum? What would be useful for you? What are the kind of high yield things that you want to learn? And so those are the kind of lessons that I've learned so far in this process. And so I'm just ending it with resources, the articles that were referenced and the images that were used in this presentation. I also wanted to thank my team at Texas Children's and Baylor College of Medicine, especially my co-PI, Dr. Ramirez, but also the families who agreed to let us use the patient photos for this curriculum to be able to, again, highlight how these rashes look in different complexions. And of course, thank you to the Arthritis Foundation for their support and funding and for our opportunity to talk about our project during the summit.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chun. This is very exciting, and I'm glad that everyone was able to hear an update on this wonderful work, which you already discussed many ways in which it can be scalable. I know you will not be available to stay with us for the panel, but we do have one question that came in while you were presenting, and it was about the rotation that you were describing. So it was a question about whether it's available to individuals from anywhere in the world or just the United States?
So right now, it is currently only available to learners within the United States, just because there's also a lot more hurdles in terms of the administration, in terms of being able to get out of the country learners. But personally, my goal is hopefully if we can show that this rotation was impactful and effective this coming year, then my dream would be if we could kind of be able to find funding to make this not just a 1 year thing, but an annual thing, and have sites all over the country so that learners can kind of choose what location is more convenient for them, or if they want to be at a specific hospital. I would really love to be able to kind of scale this to make it more sustainable and more kind of long-term impact.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And that's part of the things we're going to discuss at the end once we've heard from everybody during the panel. But in the interest of time, I'm going to thank you so much for the great presentation. And everybody already saw the contact information. So if you have any additional questions for Dr. Chun, please don't hesitate to contact her and her co-investigator.